Hi there, everyone. My name is Max Young, and I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of Vroman's Bookstore to tonight's virtual event. Tonight, we are lucky to have with us Lauren Sandler, who will be in conversation with John Williams discussing her newest book, This Is All I Got. Again, we're so grateful that you can continue supporting our store during this time. And if you'd like to support us and the author more, you can go ahead and click the green button down below to purchase her book from our website. Tonight's event also includes a Q&A portion, so if you'd like to ask her a question, you can go ahead and click the Ask a Question button down towards the bottom again, and we'll go ahead and read those out towards the end of the event. But with all that technical stuff out of the way, let me go ahead and introduce the author and her guest. So first off, Lauren Sandler is an award-winning journalist based in Brooklyn and the author of two previous books titled One and Only, as well as The Joy of Being One and Righteous. Lauren's essays and features have appeared in dozens of publications, including Time Magazine, The New York Times, Slate, The Atlantic, The Nation, and many others. She has been on staff at Salon and at NPR, where she worked on All Things Considered, Morning Edition, Weekend Edition, and The Cultural Desk. She was a regular commentator for the BBC and has been interviewed nationally and internationally on many networks, including CNN, PBS, CBS, NBC, and throughout public radio. And with her, John Williams is the Daily Books editor / staff writer at the New York Times. He is the founder of The Second Pass, an exclusively online publication devoted to reviews, essays, and blog posts about books new and old. From 2001 to 2007, he worked in the editorial department at HarperCollins, and before that, he spent time as a journalist in Texas and an editorial intern at Harper's Magazine. So with all that out of the way, I'll go ahead and let them take the screen. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Appreciate it. That was the full bio. Reminding me I was born many moons ago. Hi, Lauren.
Hi, Don.
How are you? It's nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too.
We had a chance to talk about your book a little. Probably time is so weird and elastic now, but it was, I don't know, it was a couple of months, 5 years ago. And so I'm glad we're getting a chance to do it again. Hello to everybody in LA, but even more importantly, not in LA, since this new reality allows us to get people in from all over the place. I want to say a little more about the book before we get into it. You know, I'll just do a little bit more of a description because I know that it can help to ground people a little bit in what we're talking about. Lauren's new book, This Is All I Got, is essentially a year in the life of a young woman in New York City who is homeless, but is a lot of other things too. She's a student with a lot of aspirations. She is a very funny and very spirited person who Lauren got to know quite well in the process of reporting this book. It is a book about an issue, which is homelessness in New York and also in America. It's also a book that gets at that issue through a very personal and intimate story. And so I want to just read quickly a quote from Alex Kotlowitz, who knows a thing or two or 100 about reporting and telling difficult stories. And he wrote in the New York Times Book Review that This Is All I Got is a testament to the bigness of the small story, to the power of intimate narratives to speak to something much larger. Sandler wisely lets Camilla's story stand on its own without lecturing us. Not to sound cliched, but we walk in Camilla's shoes. We come to understand what Sandler recognized early on. If Camilla can't navigate the dearth of housing, how can others? Now, Lauren, we've all been at readings of novels and short story collections where someone in the audience or maybe even the moderator asks, where do your ideas come from? I don't think I've ever heard a good answer to that question. That's not to say I haven't heard a satisfactory answer, you know, but it's just not usually that interesting to know that about someone's imagination. But I am very curious because I actually think I rarely hear it asked of nonfiction writers. And I think it's more interesting to ask them about that because you're someone who's had a very full career in journalism. You've written 2 other books before this one. And so I'm curious about how and when you decided to write this story and how and when you knew that it was a book rather than, you know, you've written for leading magazines and newspapers, and whether that was sort of your goal from the beginning or whether that happened in the process of coming upon this story.
Well, I think the old fiction writer's response, or maybe it's just James Baldwin's response, who wrote much more than just fiction, of course, is that, you know, I think often a writer writes when they can't not write about something. And so for me, those topics and the approach to those topics comes from a place of anger and outrage. when I become so furious about something that I want to shake people, then I feel like it's almost like an embodied feeling that I need to go. I need to go into the places where these stories are lived that I not just have curiosity about, but I also have a feeling of outrage about. Not outrage about how these lives are lived from the people who are living them usually, but from the systemic factors, the cultural factors, the mythology that tells us what the world is in a way that creates systemic injustice. That's usually my impetus. And it's usually something that I feel building slowly until I'm fully in its grip. So for me, for this project, I mean, I would say that sort of feeling about housing inequality started in high school or younger. I was a city kid. I grew up in the Boston area. I've always lived right near a subway stop. I've always seen people who are street homeless my whole life, and I've always felt something for that. But then living in New York City during our now ended Gilded Age, when there was such an emphasis on luxury, on housing development, on sort of ostentatious consumption, at the same time, while there was such a rise in poverty and such a rise in homelessness, I was just feeling like, okay, I need to see how this feels from the inside, how this functions from the inside, so that I can make people feel the injustice of it.
Did you immediately, when you had that feeling, did you immediately feel like the way to do that was to tell one person's story, or did you feel like it could be a sort of, a Kafkaesque look at the bureaucracy or the politics? Or
yeah, so there was one thing I definitely didn't want it to be, which was looking at data and looking at policy. Data is important and policy is important, but part of, I think, why we continue to have the crisis of inequality that we have in this country is because we tend to talk about it in terms of numbers. And instead of that, I wanted to talk about people. I wanted to talk about feelings. I wanted to talk about daily life. And I wanted to give people an experience of something as though they were reading a novel of it, as though every word of it would be true, to sort of zero in on the individual as a way to feel the larger whole, but without sacrificing the individuality of that individual, who in this case is a woman who I call Camilla. It began as me spending some time in a shelter and getting to know a small group of women who had agreed to participate in this journalistic experiment with me. And they all had very different stories, but they all had found themselves in the same place, which was a shelter in Brooklyn. And they all found themselves telling me, as every other woman in the shelter had, that housing was their biggest issue, that there were a lot of other issues, tons of them, right? Huge intractable issues around a lack of childcare, around our welfare system, around racism, around sexism, around immigration, around work, around education. I mean, we all know what people are up against in the broadest sense, but the single biggest issue, the one that everything else was stymied by, was the inability to find affordable housing. And so I wanted to tell how that story was lived and essentially look at the entire constellation of factors that could make a person homeless in the richest city in America and the second richest city in the world. And it started off as sort of an ensemble piece, I would say, in a shelter. But quickly a protagonist emerged, both because she was such an extraordinary person, someone who was so driven, so versed in the system, so tenacious, that it really felt like if she couldn't make this work, then I couldn't imagine who could. But also because she chose me, right? So we often talk about how journalists choose the people that they write about, but in fact, it's much more of a relationship. It's an alchemy, right? So I was excited by her, but she was equally as excited by me. And she gave me the incredible privilege of stepping into her life. And so we got to this point where she was evicted from the shelter. And at that point, I had to decide, is this story, say it again?
How old was she at this time?
She was 22, and she had a The first eviction notice came when her baby was 2 weeks old and she had just had a C-section. The final eviction notice came when she was 4 months into living there, I believe, maybe 5. But it became this moment where I either needed to follow her out of the shelter, which I had considered to be the set for the story, and into her life that was going to come, or I needed to stay where I was. And she was just, I was too enraptured with her. And I think we probably were with each other in a way that I couldn't let her go. And I wanted to follow her experience through her first year of motherhood.
It's interesting you talk about that. I want to get back in a minute to the shelter and give people a little bit more. You do such a great job in the book of situating it sort of in that Gilded Age that you're talking about. But I'm curious, first, you talked about that alchemy between you and the subject, and also you talked about being outraged and coming from a place of, and I wonder how much you think of your work as, there's always those questions about like journalism and activism, and where do those lines exist? Should they exist? Do you care about them? Where do you see one bleeding into the other?
These are big questions for me. I am someone who chose to not have a newsroom life. I am someone who chose not to have a life that, as a writer, as a journalist, would be confined by some more traditional expectations of that divide. So, for example, I'm someone who shares really fully of myself in situations in which I'm reporting. I always feel like if someone's giving me their life, they have every right to be entitled to elements of my life. If they're going to talk about their family, I'm going to talk about my family. And those, I'm someone with boundary issues to begin with. So that's probably just who I am. But it also feels humane to me. I think more about work like the anthropologist Carol Stack, who wrote All Our Kin, which is a book about single motherhood in which, she and her protagonist care for each other's babies. I think they even crossfeed at some point. I wasn't going to hold myself back. I never do as a person when I'm reporting. And I tend to do less interviewing. I'm not looking for answers to my questions. I hang out. And so hanging out lends itself to that. But I also am drawn to the subjects that I write about because I'm curious, as I think most people in this country should be most of the time, about many, many things. And so in that sense, I am quite proudly an activist reporter. But in this story, there was a different complication than there is in a lot of my reporting, which is, for a journalist to fully tell an experience, you can't interrupt it all that much, right? And of course, being there changes it. Like we all know that there's no such thing as just capturing something and presenting it. And in honesty, I don't really have a lot of interest in doing that a lot of the time. I think that my perspective is worthy, and I think that the relationship I have with my subjects is something that needs to be exposed and shared. But in this situation, in writing about one woman's poverty, there were infinite questions about how could I help her out, and would I help her out, and what would that mean? I mean, I care about her infinitely. She's someone I love deeply. She's been, incredibly close to me for many years now, and really remains that way. Though we have our ups and downs, like all intense, good relationships. And in this situation, it really became a question of, okay, if I give her advice, if I give her money, if I do something that changes the trajectory of the story, what does the reader miss? What does the story lose? And so I quickly found out that I really didn't have advice to give her, to be honest. She would ask a lot, but in fact, she was the expert in her own life. I mean, Camilla is someone who, she knows the system better than anyone. She knows her values better than anyone. She knows her desires better than anyone. And I was not about to get in the way of that. My experience of life is different than hers, and I don't expect that I have answers to things that she doesn't have.
But something that she would ask you.
Oh, she'd ask my advice about things all the time. I mean, in the way that you do with someone you spend all your time with. And I got very versed in the sort of therapist, well, what do you think you should do? Sort of way of approaching things. And she would usually have an answer. And that answer is usually something that I would not have the knowledge to come up with, because I've never tried to survive in our social services system. And she's pro. So, there was that element. And then there was also the question of, okay, what do you do when someone you care about is homeless and has a baby and needs housing? And my job was to tell that story and to see where she ended up with that on her own. And yet, what would it mean if I wasn't telling her to come crash on my couch?
Which you didn't.
I did.
That was one of the things.
And in the book, I write about a moment which was particularly dire for her. And my daughter, who at the time was 8, was saying to me, who knows her well, knows her baby well, we were all very close. And she said, "Oh, how are you not inviting her to live here? We have a couch. We have a place for her to stay. It's warm. It's winter." And I write in the book that that's when my daughter learned what the word hypocrite meant. Because there is an element of hypocrisy in saying this is the thing I care about most, but I'm also willing to let this person I care about suffer for some notion of greater good, of making people feel something different.
Well, I have 2 follow-up questions about that, actually. One is I'm pretty sure from both the book and from knowing you that, Camilla, like you've said, I think in other appearances, there are things you wouldn't watch her baby freeze. But so Camilla obviously was navigating this terrible system. She was not in the dead of winter, on the street. She was always sort of cobbling something together that wasn't ideal. It wasn't, it taxed other people. It did all these other things. But so I just want to sort of, establish that you weren't sort of, your daughter wasn't asking you this while Camilla was on the street 3 blocks away in 10-degree weather. But also when you say for the greater good, that's where I'm curious about, you joked before about your boundary issues, but I actually do wonder, you're a very rigorous journalist. And so even though you make that joke, and even though I do think you share with your subjects, what is that thing that one gets by drawing lines around what they can and can't do with a subject? I mean, I know that you've thought about this a lot.
My lines are different than other people's lines. All of our lines are different, I think. I'm friendly with the journalist Rebecca Skloot, who wrote The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. And I remember telling her about when I bought Camilla's baby a snowsuit because I didn't want to watch him freeze to death in the winter. And she was appalled. And she and I had this whole argument about this, right? She said, your job as a journalist is to see what happens. It's not to step in and change the story. And my feeling was, okay, it's enough to see what happens with Camilla's, search for housing. It's enough to see what happens as she navigates welfare and childcare and her relationship with her absent parents and her desires and ambitions. I don't also need to see Alonzo freeze to death on the street. It's enough. And so for me, there were certain things that were intolerable. She did, what were some of my rules? Is that what you're wondering?
No. I'm actually wondering, you can talk about some of your rules, but I'm wondering what it is that, because it's such an interesting question. I think that you would probably, I'm actually also curious about, how you think anyone changes the story, even when obeying those rules. Because, as you said earlier, like we all know, and you were sort of referring without saying, it's like the observer effect and how it's on, it's a very like scientific, it goes beyond human interactions, but that that things are just changed by you being there, period. And so I'm curious about whether you think you did change anything, not in terms of some crazy, like, the story would have turned out much differently, but what your presence meant sometimes. And yet not what your rules were, but what you think obeying some rules, no matter what they are for you or for Rebecca Skloot, for any other journalist, Catherine Boo, or anybody else who does this kind of immersive reporting, like just for someone who isn't a journalist, what would you say is like the benefit of that? What do we get from having those like journalistic rules around things?
Well, I think that we get a sense of trust in the journalist attempting to provide the cleanest, truest possible version of something. I also think that it's imperative that journalists step away from the notion that that is possible and instead own their relationship within what they're writing. So in the book, I talk about what it must have meant to have, this older white woman in the room with her in the welfare office. And I will add, in my year plus of reporting this book in New York City, I spent infinite, it felt, hours in welfare offices, in housing offices, in child support offices, in which I was the only white person I ever saw all year. And I was there as a journalist. So my presence was clearly an anomaly. That said, Camilla's kind of pale. We have the same bone structure. We both have curly hair. Most people thought I was her mom. I'm the exact same age as her mom. So I passed, right? People who didn't think that I was her mom, who, like, you know, could sniff the Jewish girl on me, clearly thought that I was a social worker. That was another way of passing. I didn't interrupt that. I didn't march out there and say, I'm a journalist here to expose the inequalities of America. I just laid low and hung out. So I think that those rules help show us what things are really like as much as we can, right? If I had been able to afford to set her up in her own apartment, which I can't because that's not what journalism pays in America, or probably anywhere. And that would have only been a very short-term fix for a long-term problem for her, right? I was listening to Andrew Yang say the other day that you can't solve $1 trillion problem with $1 million. That was his way of talking about philanthropy and inequality. It's the same way that you can't solve a person's entire life of poverty with, several months of a rent check. It's so much more intractable than that. It's so much more massive than that. These are big systemic problems that individuals cannot solve unless those individuals are, carry the name Bezos or Zuckerberg, et cetera. Those individuals can solve things, right? So the accepted number of dollars that it would take to end homelessness in America is $20 billion. $20 billion is very little money for someone who has $110 billion. Say Jeff Bezos, he would be left with $90 billion. And our policy is what has allowed him to have that $110+ billion. It's like going up every second. He, as an individual, could solve that problem. Lauren Sandler, as a freelance journalist and author who writes about poverty, not going to solve that problem by writing a check. But what I can do is give people the experience of what it is like to live a life that no one should ever have to live. We should have housing as a human right. We should have childcare as something that is available to all parents. We should have, a balance of responsibility between mothers and fathers alike in caring for children. I mean, I could go down the list forever. This book is about the constellation of factors that makes this extraordinary young woman homeless. And it's quite a constellation. And so, what I was able to do would have been pretty minimal. And frankly, what I was able to do was hang out, and she got something out of that. She had something with her.
I just while we're talking about it, I want to follow up on the Bezos thing a little bit, because I'm curious. As someone who's studied this from multiple angles, and the way you talk about the sort of the web of intractable problems, that it's not just one thing or another, and they all sort of play off of each other. If, let's say, Bezos wrote the check tomorrow, I assume that immediately we would have the means to provide housing. I mean, actually, let me back up a step, because as someone who doesn't really follow the policy very closely, I am curious about this, because you'll hear people say, that, for instance, housing in New York, it's not that there isn't housing. It's not always that there isn't housing, or that we need to, it's that it's not affordable. It's that we don't, sort of zone it the right way. So what does the money what would Bezos's money do? And then what else would still need to be done? I assume that writing that check would feel great, and then we'd solve it for a while, but there would still be a lot of those systemic things that would still be sort of feeding into it.
Well, we need a few different things. We need housing vouchers. We need people to be able to be housing secure, to be able to pay their rent, and to not have to worry about not paying their rent. That's a basic thing. We need, for some people, I don't know how much we would have needed this for Camilla, but for other women I knew at the shelter, we need what's called supportive housing, which is not just a stable place to live, but then also some other support, some social work, some, psych help, some apparatus that helps people who are struggling more than that. Maybe it's with addiction, maybe it's with, inherited you name it, with abuse, with trauma. I think that there are very, very few people in poverty in America who have not really wrestled with some pretty extreme trauma. These are things that we also just need to give people as a human right, not as giving them anything, but because we are willing to give people the right to make an extraordinary amount of money. And it needs to be paid back into the system. It needs to be paid back so that everyone has a shot at that. In this country, it's an inheritance game. It is in many places, but it seems to be worse here. In that, who you are born to determines the course of your life almost all the time. Bootstraps are a myth. If Camilla was born to my grandparents 30 years prior, or 60 years prior, she would have had a very, very different upbringing in a different level of systemic inequality, but a far lesser one, with a better education system, with, a lot more skin privilege, a lot of different elements that have told different immigration stories across the years. It's really bad right now. Even if she was born when her mother was born, her mother had Section 8 to cover her housing. And then she had a place in the projects, which Camilla was on a wait list of 150,000 families for, and tried to get into no matter how she could. I write about how the projects are some people's worst nightmare, but for many, many other people, it's their greatest dream. It's a hope for survival. And so living in a place that determines the course of your life based on the wealth that you were born into, or the absence of wealth that you were born into, in addition to your skin color, to your gender, to, your degree of trauma. These are all things that we really need to start approaching in a radically different way than we have been.
I want to ask another process question in a second. First, I want to take a small break now to point out, which we haven't, that you can ask a question using a little button at the bottom of the screen. I will start asking those of Lauren in just a little bit. And please, there's that green button that says buy the book here. Please support both Lauren and Vroman's by buying a copy of the book tonight, and also by buying other books you've been meaning to buy, because I think this is an incredibly important time to support bookstores generally, and really anything you love, local restaurant, et cetera, et cetera. So please do that while you're here. But also do ask questions if you have anything on your mind, because Lauren has answers. Actually, now that I talk about the importance of supporting things, I actually want to pivot to that, because here you are writing this book. You were furious about the problem. And when did you start writing this book? When did you first meet Camilla?
I met her in 2015. I started working on the project in 2014, okay. Doing research, trying to find a shelter, etc. And that now feels like a really long time ago. Yeah.
So you're at.
It was. I reported this book during the Obama era. I reported this book during a time of, incredible American wealth and, that level of prosperity that seemed without end for some people and not for others. A time which I've written about a lot recently, that we could have strengthened our safety net, and instead, especially recently, of course, we really shredded it, and now we find ourselves needing it more than ever.
Yeah, I've heard you say that about the Obama era, by which you mean that even you're not. Basically, what you're saying is that during the Obama era, this was an incredibly big problem. A lot of people were delinquent about politically and policy-wise, and that's what drove you to write it. And then you get 4 years of the current government, but you also get this incredible historical moment now that we're in, where yes, you have probably before the pandemic, you have a lot of criticism probably from your in your brain about the upper echelons, the politicians, the people who are doing things. Now we're going to have a problem where what was already an immense problem on the ground side, where people are suffering, is going to be, I assume, exponentially worse.
Mm-hmm. Oh, without a doubt. I mean, I think that we've only begun to see this. If you look at the unemployment numbers, if you look at where evictions have started, it's tragic, and it doesn't have to be this way. When I think about how many lives could have been strengthened and made stable when it was a moment before any of this happened, and it seemed impossible, right? Like, let's just look at that $20 billion price tag. That was impossible. But the $3 trillion, which is a lot of that's going to the airlines, big businesses, you name it, that's suddenly available. There's another $2 trillion suddenly available, which makes $20 billion look like chump change. And frankly, if people had been in a place of far greater stability when all of this hit, this would have hit differently. And people would be able to afford being out of work far more than they can now. I mean, I think so many of us have seen how when this hit, people had $400 in the bank, which doesn't cover much if you find yourself suddenly out of a job. The $600 a month in unemployment went far, but not that far if you have a bunch of kids, not that far if you live in an expensive city. And now that's gone. So we are only on the precipice of the crisis to come, a crisis of mass unemployment, I think fairly mass poverty, mass evictions. And unless you live in pretty much New York City, you have no right to shelter. So in 1979, there was a law called Callahan that was passed that said, okay, it's a basic right in New York City to have safe shelter. The shelters aren't that safe. A lot of my book is about how bad and threatening the public shelter system is, but at least it exists. In Los Angeles, nothing like that exists. That's why there's so much street homelessness. There are very few places for people to go, and the places that people can go tend to be private. We've privatized our emergency social service system, not just in Los Angeles, also in New York, all around the country. It has to be the work of philanthropy. It has to be the work of donors and of volunteers to make sure that people have a place where they can sleep safely or not.
This is probably a dumb question, but it's not because I'm sort of, hitting a volleyball shot to you. It's because I'm fairly dumb about this stuff. So politically speaking, because when you say street homelessness, and we've talked about the difference between street homelessness and other kinds, but that is the sort of thing that you hear a lot of people complaining about from the other side. Oh, our city, there are all these street homeless people around now. So I assume that in a place like LA, you have all these people complaining, but there isn't any political will to have a right. I mean, so in other words, it would just cost municipal money to put together right to shelter, have the places where people could go, but people don't want to pay that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in places like LA and pretty much anywhere else, there's a limit to how much municipal money there is because of how policy exists, right? How finances are structured.
But because of
social services are hurting. But that is because we have an electorate that doesn't want to tax for certain things. And then you have people who don't want homeless services in their neighborhoods. This is, so it becomes a not in my backyard problem, or it becomes a not my tax dollars problem, or I work hard, why should I have to pay for that? I get that. I don't want to live next to a homeless shelter. I know how tough it is in a homeless shelter and the shit that can happen there and outside there. I get that. I really do. But I also feel like you have to get over that. I get feeling like it is hard enough to scrape by, not being paid a lot of money in America. I get that. The people who would be hurt by raising taxes should not have to pay for that. But there are people who have a lot of money and a lot of ability to be able to both change policy and fund the policy that we want to see. And it's not enough to just make a few donations. It's not enough to just show up and vote. We need to have, major systemic change here. And it's definitely not enough to just say Black Lives Matter. I mean, we have a majority urban poverty system that is inhabited by people of color. And if you don't see that, and if you don't want to take active major steps to change who gets an education, who gets to have safe and stable housing, who gets to have, decent childcare, who gets to have ambition, who gets to have desire, promise, future, you name it, psychological services, then you aren't really thinking about what systemic racism actually is and what it means to imagine an America that is far more equal than the one that we inhabit right now.
You're leading me into one of our viewer questions. So I'm going to ask that now, and I'll get to the other one that's there now also. And please add your own if you'd like. These are very good, as always. Lisa T writes, I was very moved by this book and Camilla's story. I work for the New York City Department of Education, and I have met single homeless mothers who have had similar struggles to Camilla's. What would you like to see change as a result of your writing this book and covering Camilla's story? And I would, just because she mentioned the education, I know that you were with Camilla a lot, and that she was both a good student and a the word I'm looking for, an ambitious student. So you could talk about that very specifically tied to education if you want. Obviously, any way you want to talk about it in terms of change, what needs to change and what you hope will change because you covered it this way.
Mm-hmm. I mean, any conversation about education right now in this moment needs to, I think, focus on this moment that we are in, which is a moment in which our kids are going to be taught online, and for a while at least. And so, we've all seen this discussion. We've all probably been participating in it ourselves about who has devices, who has a parent who can be with them at home, who has a school that can shift to synchronous learning in a way that is meaningful, who can manage to not be fed by their school cafeteria. All of these different questions about childcare, about parenting, about quality of education, about resilience. They've just really laid bare what we have all always known anyway. We're just living in such an extreme time right now. But that said, to speak about Camilla in particular, before any of this happened, this is a person who really, against everything that the world spat at her, was a Dean's List criminal justice student who was accepted to John Jay, the greatest criminal justice institution in the United States, and could have gone to school there and lived a life as a public servant if she had a place to live. And she didn't, so she couldn't. And now that's not what she's doing. And that element of just totally squelched promise, where no matter how hard someone works, no matter how deserving they are, there is this apparatus around instability, around safety, around poverty, that just refuses to even let our most basic mythology about American dreams come true in the best case scenarios for someone like Camilla, who's so dogged, so tenacious, so determined, and so willing to give. Imagine what it's like for people who don't have that ability, who I believe also have the right to a stable, meaningful life. I think that we really need to ask ourselves who this system is serving. And we really need to think about what our housing market means. There's something I think about a lot and I talk about a lot, which was, I was on a Zoom call early on in the pandemic with this guy, Daniel Malone, who runs a shelter in Seattle. And he said, people are going crazy about price gouging hand sanitizer. Remember that at the beginning when hand sanitizer was so expensive and no one could get toilet paper, although somehow, anyway, toilet paper remained the same price. But hand sanitizer, the street value of that stuff was like gold. And he was saying, we're furious about Purell, and yet we have been price gouging housing based on the same logic that if you have it, this is its worth. Why not sell it to the highest bidder? Why are we okay about where people can have safe shelter and raise families and have meaningful lives. But this little tiny bottle of like clear gel is the thing that we're going to get up in arms about. And I think about that all the time, that the things that we are willing to support based on a highest bidder system, a winner takes all capitalism, has just, I think, destroyed us. And it breaks my heart, and I think it should break every damn person's heart.
Let's stay there for just a second on the education question, because you addressed, I do think it's very interesting what's happening now in terms of online learning with younger kids and all the challenges that there will be with that, especially disadvantaged kids. And then you talked a bit about Camilla's own life as a student, but I'm curious about in that web, when you said if she had a place to live, she could have gone to school. I'm just wondering, is there, I see that meaning that that part of the systemic problem, the housing, sort of has this knock-on effect to education. But is there anything you saw in reporting the book, or, I mean, you're always sort of reporting something. I feel like you know a bit about everything in the policy universe, that just the education system alone could do or is not doing enough of to, and I guess I'm thinking mostly about higher education, because there's a sense in the book of, yes, Camilla is exceptional, and we don't want to get stuck on that, and like you just said, not talk about the rights of people who are not as exceptional. But there's this sense of, okay, you've gone through a process that was already disadvantaged and not great, and you succeeded, and you did the steps that most people do to get to the next thing. So how does that higher education fit into this? And is it mostly also, I assume, a matter of funding and political will?
I mean, I see everything as an issue of funding and political will. I mean, it's tricky. Like, you know, I just want everyone to read Nicole Hannah-Jones all the time. So I think that there's so many people who are doing so much better work than I have done in terms of education and education inequality. I will say it was really interesting to spend a lot of time at a community college in Brooklyn and really get a sense of how incredibly smart and dedicated and driven these kids were, to sit in political science classes, to sit in criminal justice classes, to sit in art history classes, and just, you know, and know a whole bunch of students who were homeless or who were in incredibly bad situations, some of whom had incarcerated partners, some of whom had been incarcerated themselves, some of whom, you know, were living in really bad situations, but who would show up to talk about Renaissance art with passion, who would show up with their papers on Brown versus Board of Education, which were really interesting and really different than the ones that I remember people writing. I think that there is such a sense of economic elitism around who is deserving of higher education and also who is really stepping up for that. You know, in the book Beyond Higher Ed, like in terms of access to art, theater, you name it, you know, I spent a lot of time with Camilla. I spent a year and a half with her. I've spent a lot of time with her since then. The book is about a year. So much of what is in the book is only there because I chose to not leave it out. I often say when I'm teaching nonfiction that it's less about what you write and more about the impossible choice of what not to write. But the things that remain in the book, a trip to the Guggenheim, a trip to the Met, her wonder at seeing a Lorca play, you know, these things that feel like, oh, that's not for her, right? But it is for her. It's all for her. She feels it as much as anyone else does. Her friends feel it as much as anyone else does. And I think that we need to de-stratify our relationship to, you know, in intellectual life, to meaningful work, to art, to culture, to all the things that we have as a culture in a, you know, capital C sense, decided are for people who can pay for it, are for people who will be donors, who will be on the board, who can live in the right zip code, who can show up appropriately dressed for events. You know, it's crazy to me. I think about Charisse, who was a woman who also lived in the shelter, who wanted to be a photographer. And her photography was really amazing and really interesting. But She worked at Applebee's, and that is what she thought was the best she could ever hope for from life, even though we would work on her resume over and over. And she had ideals that are no different than the kids I know who are growing up in Williamsburg, like my daughter. And it just feels like we know that it's an unlevel playing field, and we've just tilted that playing field so radically, even in the past 20 years, that it's time to tilt it back. And my concern is that this pandemic will do the opposite of that, that we are in a moment in which people with economic security will be infinitely safer, and people without it will be infinitely more at risk, and that the world will be turned inside out even more than it already is.
Okay. On that hopeful note, I'm going to ask the other question that's currently in the little question lobby for us. People are being shy. Margaret asks, do you think that the agencies that are quote unquote claiming to help the homeless are going to come through, or is it just empty promises, as I have always heard? Which is an interesting question, and also I guess gets at like what is being done and who's doing it and how effective is it and all that.
No, they're not. And they can't. And it sucks. So here's what it's like. You are dealing with totally overloaded, totally overfunded agencies. The people who work in these agencies are literally the most minuscule financial step above the people who they serve. So, you know, what that means is that in the best of times, for Camilla to get a check paid to her homeless shelter, she would have to go to the welfare center 5 times and spend 5 days in a waiting room just to get the paperwork for 1 check. And the people who were responsible for making that happen are also people who are essentially living in poverty themselves and are dealing with a completely overloaded system, terrible training, you know, just pay. So, okay, we're going to talk about administrative burden here for a second. Bear with me, John. I'm getting a little professorial. I
knew we'd get to administrative burden.
So there's this concept called administrative burden. There are a couple of professors at Georgetown who have written a really interesting book about this, which my sister-in-law handed me and which opened my eyes, which is that, you know, the draconian policies, the, you know, unnavigatable paperwork. Oh my God, I could not make heads or tails of this paperwork. The impossibility of even getting the most basic services is not a glitch in the system. It is how the system is built, because people will drop out of it, because it is impossible, because it is dehumanizing, because it is as Kafkaesque as you can imagine. And so imagine if you have depression, imagine if you have learning disabilities, imagine if you don't have the time to wait in those waiting rooms or to suffer through the stack of paperwork. This is what keeps people out of the system, not because they are okay, but because they are so not okay that they can't manage being in the system, that they can't manage what it takes to get a check, what it takes to get childcare, what it takes to apply for public housing, which is probably unavailable anyway. This is where we are, and this is where we were, frankly, in the best of times. Now we're in the worst of times, and it is much worse. And so I do not think that social services are going to give us anything that we need for our American population. And I think that the people who work in those offices are in a terrible situation. And I think that we need to address this immediately. But it's not a sexy topic. Administrative burden is not going to get anyone hot, and it's not going to get anyone to the polls, and you're not going to be like, hey, vote for me. I, you know, minimize the wait time at the job center from 6 hours to 1 hour. That would be a huge deal, but it's not going to get anyone excited.
I don't know. At the end of a long week, I like to unwind with a cocktail and some light reading about administrative burden. I'm excited. No, but I think it will get people furious, though, because I think, you know, what you're describing is something that everyone knows on some level. Like if you just said to people, you know, people who have much, much less than you are basically going to the DMV every day for hours at a time because they have less than you. Like, does that sound right to you? And then just,
Sure, I love that you brought that up, because I have gotten probably 20 emails, including from an editor at the Times, and yesterday from my mother-in-law, when they leave the DMV saying, I read your book and then I went to the DMV and I now realize this is what it's like to be poor in America and try to get services. You are literally spending your life at the DMV. And it is, in many ways, much like that, except you don't get to get in your car and go home to your nice home at the end of the day. I mean, it's, so this is why I wrote this book. This is really why I wrote this book, was so that people could feel this, so that people could live through elements of the stress and elements of the struggle and also elements of the hope. But to feel how this life is lived. And I know that that is not a way to sell this book to anyone. I will also say people find it to be a very gripping, moving book. And I am glad for that. It is hard to make the boredom and frustration of poverty gripping. And so I'm glad that some people think that I did. But truly, this was the purpose. I read novels. I wanted to write something that read like a novel, in which people could trust that every word was true about how life is lived in America if you're born poor, and if you don't have family to help you out. And that, to me, is the purpose of this, that we need to get out of our own shoes. We need to get out of our own silos. And we need to experience what it is like to not live the lives that those of us who were lucky to be born outside of poverty have, honestly think we can imagine, but we can't. I thought I could imagine it. That's why I wrote this book. I thought I knew how bad it was. And I knew it was so bad, and I was going to go out and show how bad it was. And I feel like I did that, but I lived a lot along the way. I had to, confront how boring things are, and how endless things are, and how hopeless things are on a level that I had not anticipated. And that, a lot of readers have reached out to me saying, I was homeless for a long time. I'm a single mother who's lived in poverty for a long time. Your book was the first thing that I have read that made me feel like I could read my own experience. And that, to me, is the most validating aspect of any of this, is A, that I got it right, but also that, that an experience that felt familiar to people that we don't ever get to feel could maybe be felt by people who haven't had that experience before. And so that's what books can do. That's the magic of books, is being able to step into another life. And that's what I hope I've given people.
Well, I think you have, and we're gonna do this quickly, and I know we can. That's why I'm asking you, because I know we can do it quickly, because I told
Sandler, how do you fix it in 30 seconds or less?
We have to be done by the top of the hour, or Vroman's they have some regional goons here in New York who are going to come to my door. So we got like 2 minutes here. So
all right.
First, I'm going to thank everybody for being here. Thank Lauren. Buy Lauren's book. Support Vroman's.
Thank you.
Vroman's is apparently open 7 hours a day. So if you are in LA, go there and buy books.
Oh my God. And send Margaret Castro to law school. Everyone, please read this comment.
Okay.
Margaret Castro is no, John. I'm sorry. I get to be me for one moment and talk over you and point to this thing. Margaret Castro is living in a shelter in the LA area because of the pandemic and never thought that she would be here and wants to go to law school. Margaret, please write me, laurenosandler@gmail.com. Find me on my website, tweet at me, whatever. Let's find you some support, okay? For real. Okay, sorry, John.
No, I think that's
your question.
No, but now you have 35 seconds. Thank you, Margaret, and good luck, and thank you for being here. So Lisa T writes, because we get into the systemic stuffs, and it is hard not to talk about it as data and policy, but the reason people call the book gripping is because it really is told very closely through Camilla's eyes, through her experience, and it is gripping in that way that daily life is, even when it's boring and difficult. So Lisa T writes, is there a message that Camilla would like readers to take home from her story? And then this might be, we might I'm not sure, Camilla, you would want to say this, but since the completion of this book, has Camilla resolved some of her struggles?
I don't want to speak for Camilla. I know her well. I love her dearly. I don't know necessarily at this moment what she wants people to take from this story. I think it's been a process for her. And she, you know, I don't want to give you any spoilers about it, but
maybe when the paperback comes out.
Say that Camilla is in a more stable place, but that stable place is not because we helped her as an American people. It's not because the system worked for her. It's not because she was able to get where she needed to go of her own doing with what we could provide. And it should have been. And so at the end of the book, I write, and I will not tell you what happens, but I will say, here's a story, and that may sound like a happy ending, but it isn't one. And then I talk about why it isn't, which is because we as a system have failed her.
I will say, having read the book, that this is not a spoiler, I don't think. Jeff Bezos does not make an appearance near the end. And
with like a giant checkbook, or like you get a house and you get a house.
It's not like the system has been solved and you have to read Lauren's book to figure that out. No, this is still a problem. Read the book, get educated, talk to Margaret, and thank you all for being here.
Oh my God, please vote. Vote.
Thank you, Vroman, for having us, and thank you again, Lauren. It's always a delight.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Vroman. Support your independent bookstores, especially this incredible community at Vroman's, and just keep reading and vote. Vote. Did I mention vote?
Good night, everybody.
Good night.